Coming up on this Monday edition of Newsline at Noon, pressure is building on Korea's rival parties to reach a compromise as they go head-to-head over a probe on April's ferry disaster, hours before a regular parliamentary session kicks off. The White House reiterates there has been no shift in its North Korea policy despite a reported meeting between officials of the two countries and a planned US visit by North Korea's foreign minister. Plus, top American senators call for US weapons aid to Ukraine to help it fight pro-Russian rebels as President Putin calls for talks on statehood for eastern Ukraine. These stories and more on Newsline at Noon.
It's New Monday here in Korea. Thanks for tuning in on this first day of September. Live from Seoul, I'm Eoh Jin-joo.
It's very good to have you with us. I'm Mark Broom. Our top story this lunchtime. Recent reports of a US official making a surprise trip to Pyongyang had many wondering, really, if Washington had a change of heart on its North Korea policy.
But the White House says it hasn't, but could there be subtle signs of a slight shift in direction? Choi San has more.
Washington is sticking with its policy of not engaging with North Korea just for the sake of holding talks. In a written statement to South Korea's Yonhap News, National Security Council spokesperson Patrick Van Trell said the U.S. is open to dialogue with the North, but will decide on re-engaging with the regime based on its actions and not words. By actions, the spokesperson said Pyongyang would need to show it's sincere about ending its nuclear weapons development and that it's ready to fulfill past commitments. Unconfirmed reports of an informal meeting between U.S. and North Korean officials in Pyongyang and the North Korean foreign minister's attendance at the UN General Assembly later this month have fueled speculation of renewed dialogue between the two sides. There's something to make out of Washington's statement, especially as it comes after its informal civilian meeting with North Koreans in May. The Obama administration may have decided to maintain its North Korea policy following that contact. On the other hand, the NSC spokesperson urging the North to use a New York-based channel instead of civilian routes to communicate with the U.S. deserves some attention. Washington's soon-to-be-appointed six-party talks envoy Sidney Seiler, the post in charge of the New York channel, could seek to better utilize it. The Obama administration can certainly make use of that channel to control North Korea's provocative behavior ahead of midterm elections in November. And the three Americans detained in the North, widely speculated to have been the purpose of the reported trip to Pyongyang by an American official, could force the U.S. to seek negotiations. Choi San, Arirang News.
Now, with renewed hopes of bringing North Korea back to the negotiating table, South Korea plans to send its top security advisor to Washington in the next few days. The South's presidential office spokesperson, Min Kyung-uk, says the two sides are discussing the National Security Office Chief Kim Kwan-jin's trip and that it would center around cooperation with his U.S. counterparts. This trip, widely expected to be around the Chuseok or Korean Thanksgiving holiday early next week, would be Kim's first as President Park Geun-hye's top presidential advisor. Topping the agenda will be the likelihood of Pyongyang agreeing to Seoul's proposed talks on the prospect of lifting some sanctions on their joint commercial projects. Now, in a rare display of foreign sports stars and loud cheering in North Korea, professional wrestlers have been bringing some circus-style mayhem to Pyongyang. Some watchers speculate the event, which is co-hosted by a very well-known Japanese lawmaker, will help to improve relations between the two countries, North Korea and Japan, that is. Our Son Jung-in has this report.
The crowd cheers as renowned names from the wrestling world like Bob Sapp and Jerome Le Banner take to the ring. The last time Pyongyang hosted a pro wrestling competition like this was in April 1995. Foreign media reported on the event, taking a greater interest in the changes they have noticed in the state, such as its developed infrastructure and increasingly savvy spectators.
This is the first time I've watched such an event. It was very impressive. I hope these friendly games take place more often for the sake of unity.
Some American visitors were in attendance, including Pras Michel, who co-founded the hip-hop group The Fugees.
The infrastructure seemed really good for a third world country.
At least what we're allowed to see.
Right. Well, yeah. Exactly.
With guests like Pras Michel, who is a friend of U.S. President Barack Obama, some speculate it was North Korea's move to improve its international relations, but experts view it as an ordinary sports diplomacy event that Pyongyang has been holding for a long time.
The move is seen as North Korea's way to show that its young leader is active and friendly to the people by hosting athletic events.
In line with the competition, Antonio Inoki, a Japanese wrestler turned lawmaker who co-hosted the event, met with North Korea's ceremonial head of state Kim Young-nam over the weekend. They are believed to have exchanged views on Japanese nationals who were abducted by North Korean agents in the 1970s and 80s. Son Jung-in, Arirang News.
The National Assembly kicked off its 100-day regular session on this Monday to deliberate on dozens of bills that have been piling up for months. But before they can be pushed through, the rival parties will need to come to a resolution on the much-disputed Seoul ferry bill. Ji Myung-gil reports on the gridlock at Parliament.
Korea's rival parties have been locking horns for months over a special bill designed to uncover the causes of April's ferry accident. Extraordinary sessions were held in July and August, but not a single bill was passed amid the bipartisan wrangling.
The regular parliamentary session must meet the needs of the people. We must work on next year's budget plans and pass bills related to improving the livelihoods of the people.
The ruling Saenuri Party and the main opposition New Politics Alliance for Democracy have on two separate occasions reached agreements on the ferry bill. But in both cases, the main opposition party quickly backtracked amid backlash from the victims' families.
The Saenuri Party and the victims' families must reach a compromise over the Seoul ferry bill. The New Politics Alliance for Democracy has been persistent in its efforts to enact a special bill.
Relatives demand that the committee tasked with looking into the ferry disaster are given full investigative powers. It's a demand that the ruling party has been unwilling to meet. In attempts to break the impasse, Saenuri Party floor leader Lee Wang-gu will hold a third round of talks with the victims' families on Monday. The prolonged political standoff could affect the government's 2015 budget proposal. Next year's spending bill has to be passed by the end of November, or the government risks starting the year with a provisional budget. And with Korea's Chuseok holiday coming next week, the rival parties are under even more pressure to make progress in the coming days. Ji Myung-gil, Arirang News.
And on to some new developments on the Seoul ferry disaster. The government says that the deceased owner of the ferry operator Yoo Byung-eun and his family should pay for all the costs in dealing with the aftermath of the disaster and also compensate the victims' families. The total amount has been calculated at some 600 billion won, that's roughly $590 million US. But since retrieving the full amount will be only possible after the special Seoul bill becomes signed into law, the government is urging the two major parties to come to an agreement as soon as possible. Meanwhile, a two-day funeral service for Yoo Byung-eun came to an end on Sunday. Four of his family members, including his eldest son, wife, and younger brother, who were temporarily released from detention to attend the funeral, are now back in police custody.
Stay up to date on the latest news out of Korea. Connecting to our team of reporters about the issues that matter to Korea. On air, on your mobile, online. Find out more about Korea on Newsline at Noon with Mark Broom and Eoh Jin-joo.
I'm Eoh Jin-joo.
Market researcher, strategy analytics, said Thursday that LG Electronics brought in about 11.
With Ukraine losing ground to pro-Russian rebels and Russian President Vladimir Putin calling for statehood of the regions, the West is weighing its options. In the U.S., there are increased calls to provide weapons to Kiev to even the odds. Connie Kim has the latest.
There are increased calls among U.S. politicians to begin arming Ukraine in its fight against what they're calling a Russian invasion. Robert Menendez, the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said Russian President Vladimir Putin must pay for his, quote, aggression. Speaking to CNN, the Democrat said Washington should provide Ukrainians with weapons to defend themselves. Senator John McCain echoed the sentiment and said Putin is trying to restore the Russian Empire. He called for stronger sanctions on Moscow. The comments out of the U.S. came after Putin called for the statehood of eastern and southern Ukraine.
Substantive, meaningful talks concerning not only technical issues but also related to the issues of the society's political organization and statehood in southeastern Ukraine should begin immediately in order to protect legitimate interests of people living there.
President Putin added that Russia as a state could not stand by and do nothing while its people were being shot at by Ukrainian forces. Russia had previously called for federalization that would give greater rights to eastern Ukraine, but this is the first time Putin has called for statehood. Putin's spokesman later insisted that the statement did not amount to an endorsement of the separatist rebels and that only Kiev can reach an agreement with them. Pro-Russian separatists have been gaining ground on Ukrainian forces in eastern and southern Ukraine. The conflict erupted in April following Russia's annexation of Crimea the previous month. Connie Kim, Arirang News.
A Japanese professor who has been pushing for a resolution to the issue of Japan's wartime sexual enslavement of Korean women has a grim outlook on the matter. He says public sentiment on the issue has plunged in Japan following Seoul's rejection of Tokyo's previous efforts to make amends. Hwang Seung-yi reports.
Japan has done its best to resolve the issue of its wartime sexual enslavement of Korean women, and the Japanese public will not allow for fresh apologies or a higher degree of compensation than was already given. That's the grim outlook put forward by Yasuaki Onuma, a professor of international law at Meiji University and the former director of the Asian Women's Fund. Set up by the Japanese government in 1995, the fund collected private donations and sent compensation to 364 former comfort women in Taiwan, the Philippines, the Netherlands, and Korea, each of whom received roughly $30,000. The government also provided direct funding for medical care for the recipients and issued hand-signed letters of apology from then Prime Minister Tomichi Murayama. In a recent interview with a group of Korean reporters in Tokyo, Onuma said hardline Korean civic groups were largely responsible for the current impasse. He said the Korean Council for the Women drafted for military sexual slavery by Japan harshly criticized the 7 Korean comfort women who decided to accept the money, saying they were once again selling themselves to Japan by taking Japanese cash. Onuma ruled out a revival of the Asian Women's Fund, pointing to the icy public sentiment in Japan. He said many Japanese people feel the country put its greatest efforts into resolving the comfort women issue and was rejected by Korea, adding that similar actions will not be allowed amid the current nationalistic tide in Japan. The Japanese professor said the individual happiness of the comfort women must be prioritized and that the issue should not become entangled in the diplomatic feud between Korea and Japan. Hwang Seung-yi, Arirang News.
And staying on the topic of Japan's wartime sexual slavery, the United Nations Human Rights Chief is urging Japan to come clean on its sexual enslavement of women before and during World War II. Navi Pillai's comments in an interview with Korea's Yonhap News Agency come as she wraps up her 6-year term as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights on Monday. Pillay said Tokyo should take, quote, immediate and effective legislative and administrative measures to ensure every allegation of sexual slavery is investigated. She expressed regret at the lack of progress on the issue while the victims have been passing away and stressed the importance of education in Japan on the matter. More than 200,000 women, many Korean, were forced to serve Japanese troops as sex slaves in the early 20th century.
Korean exports slipped a bit last month from a year earlier. The Trade Ministry says outbound shipments stood at $46.2 billion in August. That's down 0.1% from the previous year. The slight drop was attributed to a fewer number of working days and less output in the auto sector due to summer vacations. Imports went in the other direction last month, up 3.1% to $42.8 billion, putting the trade surplus for August at $3.4 billion. Samsung Group's shipbuilding and engineering units have announced that they will merge before the year's end as the nation's top conglomerate speeds up its restructuring drive. Samsung Heavy Industry and Samsung Engineering say they will proceed with the merger with a stock ratio of 2.36 Samsung Heavy Industry shares per one Samsung Engineering share. The units say this will provide a synergy effect in designing, purchasing and managing onshore as well as offshore plants. The merger, set to be completed by December 1st, will boost their revenue to a combined $40 billion by the year 2020. That's up 60% from last year.
On this week's Industry Insight, we take a look at the electric car battery industry that's considered by many to be one of the next major growth engines for Korea.
Yeah, it certainly is. And as our Hwang Ji-ae tells us, Korean electric car battery makers are competing to gain an upper hand in this industry. Electric cars are still too pricey. Okay, let's take a look.
Electric cars are still too pricey compared to their counterparts relying on combustion engines that few want to buy one. The key to slashing the price and luring more consumers to this emission-free auto market is cutting the costs of the battery, which accounts for 40% of the car's total price. So could the electric car era hit anytime soon? Take a look. By 2020, more than 10 million eco-friendly vehicles powered by batteries are expected to be on the roads. And this industry of tomorrow is taking root here in Korea with a couple of local companies spearheading the global electric car battery market. Korean makers LG Chem and Samsung SDI are expected to make up half the electric car battery market share this year. LG Chem recently won a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars from Audi, raising the number of its global customers to 20. They include General Motors, Ford, Renault, and Hyundai. Samsung SDI supplies batteries to BMW. Japan was the pioneer for electric car batteries, but experts say Korean firms are better positioned at this point.
The competitive edge of local battery makers has strengthened since developing batteries for mobile phones and other home appliances. Based on that, they're now building up their technology for batteries in electric and hybrid vehicles.
Battery life is not necessarily the main stumbling block anymore. Companies already have the technology to develop a battery that can run around 320 kilometers on a single charge, more than enough for a normal daily drive for most commuters. But the key in building a big enough electric car market is driving down the price. So the name of the game is to secure a system of mass production, and little wonder battery makers are vying to strike deals with as many automakers as possible as their customers.
The electric car market is still in its early stages, so once battery makers establish business relationships with automakers, it's likely to continue for decades. It's important to secure deals, although they might face losses for now.
The race to win more customers is heating up. The biggest competitor, Panasonic, has teamed up with American electric car maker Tesla to build a massive battery factory in the U.S. It's a big leap by the Japanese battery maker, and the fierce rivalry should ensure the era of electric cars will come sooner than we ever thought possible. 황지혜, 아리랑 뉴스.
Time now for a look through the international headlines we're following on this Monday afternoon. For that, we turn to our Eunice Kim standing by at the news centre.
Eunice, thousands of protesters took to the streets of Hong Kong last night after China announced its framework for direct elections that will take place in 2017.
Right, Jin-joo. That's because the Chinese Communist Party on Sunday ruled out open nominations for those elections for Hong Kong's next chief executive. Pro-democracy activists said this was, quote, a direct slap at them and promised to continue fighting for full democracy in China's special administrative region. Our Park Ji-won tells us more.
Some 5,000 citizens have taken to the streets of Hong Kong's financial hub, calling for full democracy in the election for its next leader in 2017.
Some officials, who we don't even know how they got chosen in the first place, are telling us Hong Kong people, this place is Beijing's turf. Today I have to tell you this is definitely not true. Hong Kong is Hong Kong people's own turf.
The latest Occupy Central protests, as they are called, were sparked by a ruling out of China's parliament that will allow just 2 to 3 candidates to run for chief executive of Hong Kong in 2017. All of the candidates will first need to gain majority backing from a nominating committee, meaning it will be almost impossible for opposition politicians to even register as candidates.
We have to voice out that we don't agree with the Chinese government's decision. We want democracy. We want a fair system to protect the environment of Hong Kong.
Despite the protests, current Hong Kong chief executive is defending Beijing's decision, saying it is a milestone of democratic reform.
Universal suffrage for the CE election through one person, one vote by Hong Kong people is not only a big step forward for Hong Kong, but also a historic milestone.
The Occupy Central protesters see it another way and have promised mass protests against the decision out of Beijing in the weeks and months to come. Park Ji-won, Arirang News.
And political protests in Pakistan have turned fatal Sunday as police clashed with opposition activists, calling for the resignation of Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. They allege Pakistan's leader was elected via corruption and election fraud, allegations the 64-year-old has denied. The confrontation in Islamabad, the capital, was triggered late Saturday night, ending with 3 people killed and almost 400 others wounded. After the deadly clashes, Pakistan's army commanders expressed their concern, but said they support democracy, as Prime Minister Sharif was elected in the country's first civilian transfer of power. Thailand's former army chief and now Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha has named the members of his cabinet. He's placed current and former military generals to lead the ministries of defense, justice, commerce, and foreign affairs, among others, making up more than 1/3 of the available positions. General Prayut was officially made interim prime minister last week after receiving the king's endorsement, a post he is to hold until a general election is slated for next year. Now, concerns have been growing that Thailand will be ruled by the military after Prayut had led a bloodless coup against the elected government of Yingluck Shinawatra earlier this year. And we told you the iPhone 6 very well could be unveiled at Apple's media event next Tuesday. And now there are reports that the American tech giant is making headway on its plans to turn its best-selling gadget into a mobile wallet. Sources tell Bloomberg that Apple is in talks with Visa, MasterCard, and American Express to partner in its mobile payment system that conceptually would allow users to pay with their phone at the cash register using NFC technology and the phone's fingerprint recognition reader. If true, Apple would still need to convince U.S. retailers to adopt the technology, where it enjoys the largest market share.
It's September, and we should start noticing that highs are dipping as we get closer to the fall, but not yet. For today, highs will hover near 30 degrees Celsius nationwide, and due to instability in the atmosphere, the central parts of the nation will see sporadic showers in the late afternoon, while the rest of the country will see mostly to partly sunny skies. So if you're in the upper parts, don't forget to have an umbrella ready on your way out. With that, let's take a closer look at the readings for today. The afternoon high in the capital and Gwangju will rise to 30, while Daegu and Busan will make it to 28 and 27 later on. Now for other regions, Jeju Island and Daejeon will top out at 26 and 29, while Dokdo should see high of 23. Now it seems like nationwide showers are in the picture by midweek. It will start in the southern regions on Tuesday afternoon, then spread to upper regions by Wednesday, and it's expected to be a heavy one. Also, temperatures will be dipping down into the low 20s even here in the capital. So please do keep that in mind. And that's all for me today, and let's send it back to Mark and Jin-joo in the studio.
Well, thank you very much, Jion, for the weather update there. And those are stories we're following at this hour.
Mark and I'll be back at the same time on Tuesday.
Yes, until then, goodbye.